So it's July, and I want to talk to you about the things you need to consider if you want to plant in the middle of summer, which may seem strange, but it's really not. Just because the stores aren't telling you to plant, and just because it's not as easy to get seedlings and everything now, does not mean that it is not a good time to plant. If you're new here, hi, I'm Kiri. I'm a micro homesteader in Ontario, and my zone is 5B. On this channel, we talk about all things micro homesteading, from growing outdoors in the garden, as well as indoors hydroponically, and other ways that you can become more self-sufficient and reduce your reliance on the grocery store. So if that's your thing, or if you'd maybe like that to be your thing, then go ahead and hit subscribe and the notification bell and all that jazz so you won't miss any future videos. We need to talk about things you can plant in July. It's July and the garden is growing like crazy. Been harvesting some of my garlic. My potatoes are going to be out very soon, so there's already spaces that are starting to become freed up that I don't want to just leave empty spaces, because that's space for me to grow more food. So I definitely want to fill up those gaps in the garden with things that can produce food for me and my family. For certain things, this is actually a better time to plant than in the spring, which is typically where stores will go and put out all the vegetables all at the same time. But just because the stores are putting out everything at the same time doesn't mean that's the best time to plant it. So one of the reasons to plant is in July is so that you'll have a fall harvest. And certain crops are actually going to taste better if they've been through a light frost. So those are some of the things you want to consider starting now, because if they'd been started in the spring, they would never hit that frost before they reached maturity. Now, while it is good to plant in the summer, it's not going to be exactly the same as it was when you planted in the spring. So because we're after the summer solstice, you're going to need to take that into account. It's going to mean it's going to take a little bit longer for things to mature. So typically you can go ahead and add 10 to 14 days to the maturity date that's on your seed packages. Take that into account so that you don't run out of time to get your harvest. So one of the most important things to take into consideration when you're planting in July is how many days you have left until your first frost. So it's pretty easy to find out. You can just go onto Google and type in where you live and just say, what is the first fall frost date for wherever you are. For me, Pickering is about October 10th. And we also have to keep in mind their averages. So it doesn't mean it's actually going to be on October 10th. It gives you an idea, and that's kind of the range that you're going to take into account. Once you have that first frost date, the average, then what you're going to want to do is you can either use a good old-fashioned calendar. I dragged this one outside because puppies, adorable. Or you can just type it into Google, or you could ask Siri and just say how many days are left until whatever your first frost date is, and that will give you a number. It should tell you from today how many frost-free days you have left. So this is a very important number. When you're considering what to plant, you need to look at the days to maturity for that variety. Then add on the 10 to 14 days, because we're after the summer solstice, and then see if that fits within the window of the amount of frost-free days you have left. Even though you might want to add a little bit more buffer just in case the frost happens sooner. So one of the things I've done is create a fall planting guide, and I'll put the link down in the description. It's free. So you guys can use it if it's helpful. It just goes through helping you figure out your first frost date, and some explanations that I've talked about on the cold and the cold sensitive and the frost hardy plants. It's got some information for all the different plants that I suggested. There's a garden layout, the tracker, just some information to summarize it. There's a section where you can put in any other plants that you have. Yeah, so anyways, I'll put the link in the description if you think this would be helpful. At this point, you should know when's your first fall frost, how many frost-free days you have left. Then we need to talk about how things are different now than when they were in the spring. But obviously the temperatures are hotter now than they were in the spring. So one of the things that's changed is the soil temperature is going to be a lot warmer than it was in the spring. Because we're in the summer, there's also going to be higher pest pressures. So you have to kind of take that into account and take some preventative measures to protect the seedlings, because they're going to be vulnerable because they're young. So you don't want them to fall victim to pests before they have a chance to get established and to thrive. So we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. The last thing that we need to take into account is cold sensitive versus frost hardy plants. Now, there's still time to plant both, but we're gonna have to be much more careful with the cold sensitive plants and make sure that they are going to reach maturity within the amount of frost-free days that you have left. Comes to things like pest pressures. One of the things you're going to want to do is obviously reduce them. You can do this by interplanting or companion planting with things that are going to dissuade pests like marigolds or calendula, so you can use some of those and plant those in between your seedlings. The other thing that's an option is using row covers so that it keeps the plants protected once they're getting established and when the pest pressure is still high. Once we get out of summer and things start to cool down more, the pest pressure is going to go down and then you can remove the row covers. So we have to keep the seedlings safe. We also have to keep them at the right temperature. For some of these more cold sensitive plants, they are not going to thrive in the heat of the summer, so we have to make sure to keep them cool. Now, one way to do that is using a shade cloth, which you can put over them to kind of reduce the temperatures. The other thing you can do that doesn't cost anything is to leverage the microclimates in your yard. Microclimates are pretty much, there's going to be variations. Some places in your yard are going to be warmer, some places are going to be cooler. I'm gonna go grab my digital thermometer and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so I have my handy dandy digital thermometer, and this is actually what I use when I am making soap, but today we are going to use it to learn about microclimates. Here out in the open, okay, so we've got 23 degrees there. And then we'll go over here on the other side and same, about 23 degrees. Now, if we are going to, I'm going to aim it underneath. See? Underneath where it's covered by a lot of the leaves. We dropped a couple of degrees. Again, we'll look over here under the tomatoes. Cooler. Again, more out in the open, temperature goes up again. Quite a bit warmer. And then in the potato patch, we're dropping down again. That's what I mean when I'm talking about microclimates. There's different places where you could plant things where they're going to be more shaded and the temperature will drop, which will give them an opportunity to get established. Another thing that you can do is plant things a little bit deeper where the soil is going to be a little bit cooler lower down. If you're planting seeds, put them a little deeper than you normally would. Not too deep because you don't want them to use up all their energy before they've been able to get above the soil. And if you are planting seedlings, again, plant them a little bit deeper where it's going to be a bit cooler. That's for the frost hardy things. Another thing that's going to be super important when you're planting in July when it's very hot is to make sure that you're watering properly. But you're definitely going to want to water deeply, and the deep watering is just going to help prevent them from drying out, which is one of the quickest things that's going to kill these seedlings in the heat of the summer. They really need more babying than things do in the spring, but it's well worth it to extend your growing season, increase your harvest. And like I said, some of those vegetables are going to actually taste better once they get touched by frost. So before I jump into the different things that you can actually plant, I'm going to do them in two groups. We're going to do the cold sensitive ones first. Those are the ones that have to reach maturity before we hit that first frost date. And then after that, I will talk about the frost hardy ones that can go a bit beyond that. So let's jump into the list. The first thing on the list is beans. So I have a bunch. You could either do the bush beans or the pole beans. Again, just make sure that you're checking how many days they take to get to maturity and also what you want to use them for. So pole beans give you beans throughout a longer period, but you get less at one time, whereas the bush beans are going to just give you a mass at a single time. You'll just go pick them all, getting all their fruit for the same time. Bush beans that I will be planting in July are some of these, like I said, the Red Swan bush beans from Baker Creek. Pole beans, I'm doing these Chinese red noodle beans. Also doing some of the old Homestead. Be careful because there's a hole in there because I just keep stuffing. I saved a bunch of these from last year and filled it back up again. So these ones I really like as well. So next on the list of the cold sensitive crops you can plant in July are cucumbers. I have a couple that I'm doing. I'm trying these China Jade cucumbers from Baker Creek. I'm also doing the 7082 cucumber from Row 7 Seeds. And I'm going to throw in a couple of these Baker Creek Early Russian cucumbers. Next is squash, and you should be able to do both winter and summer squash as long as you pay attention to the varieties So it's not just any of them. You have to make sure that you're getting them that will have enough, that are quick enough to maturity. So one of the summer squash that I'm doing are these Ron Denise zucchinis. They're really quick. I think they're like 50 or 60 days to maturity, so that's a great one. And that's it for me for summer squash, but you could look up other varieties. When it comes to winter squash, spaghetti squash is a great one that you could use. I've always found them to be extremely prolific. They give you a lot of return on a single seed. One thing to keep in mind with the squash is squash bugs are going to be a lot more active now, so those row covers are going to be important to protect them from the squash bugs, because you do not want to lose your little seedlings to the squash bugs. I did a blog post on dealing with squash bugs. I will link it down in the description below if you want to check that out. The last of the cold sensitive, I would say, is herbs, and one of the ones that I would suggest is basil, which I think I sat on, but yeah, so definitely that plant's probably gonna have to be replaced. But I seem to always sit on the basil, but this is one of the areas where I can actually sit on the edge of my raised bed, so I tend to sit here, thus the basil sitting. So anyways, basil is a great one to get some herbs in the ground and have that, and then make some delicious pesto, which you can freeze and save for when it's winter and cold and and fresh basil is going to be super expensive at the store. So the first one that I would suggest is carrots. I have to do all of these varieties because I didn't get any carrots in the spring. I used up the space for other things, so I'm gonna plant my carrots now. I mentioned about the importance of watering, and deep watering. Carrots need it so much. They are very finicky, they can be hard to germinate. One of the things that can be very useful is when you first put in the seeds, to put a plank of wood on top of them. Make sure it's not pressure treated, but just a natural wood, just kind of cover them up, and that can help with germination and to help keep it cooler and to keep the moisture in. So that's a good tip for starting carrots. Yep. Next on the cold hardy vegetables are beets. So I did grow these in the spring. I had a lot of problems with leaf miners. I took off as many of the leaves that were damaged as I could, and I still got some really good beets. I got a beet harvest. I actually harvested them today. I've also been multi-sowing my beets, which I find is really, really helpful. I will do a separate video on multi-sowing, but basically it's just putting more than one seed in a little clump. I've actually grown the best beets I've ever grown. Swiss chard is another frost hardy vegetable that you can plant. I have some rainbow chard that I'm probably going to be putting in. It's a sturdy vegetable. I never liked it growing up. I'm still not actually sure I really like it, but I'm trying to eat healthier, so I'm gonna plant some. And the rainbow chard is just beautiful, like really, really deep, like magenta pink and a bright, bright yellow. I love it. Well, I love to look at it. And hopefully I'm gonna love to eat it, or learn to love to eat it. Next is the brassicas. Includes the bok choy, kale, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi. So most of the brassicas are going to take on a sweeter flavor once they've been through a bit of a frost. So these ones you're going to want to preferably start them inside. I had already started mine. So this is one of my, this is a graffiti cauliflower. This is a purple one. So I started these indoors under grow lights just to transplant out when they're like 3 or 4 inches tall. They're a little bit more resilient. They're going to need more of that microclimate that I was talking about, where it's going to be a little bit cooler. So a shade cloth or planted or where there's going to be cooler temperatures until they get established and can get growing. I have to show you, I've got one here. I have to show you, I'm so excited. This, it's like a fractal. I love it. So it is the Romanesco Italia. I'm not convinced whether it's a broccoli or a cauliflower, but it's beautiful, and it's my first time growing this, so I'm really hoping it does well. So kale is a great one to plant as well. I'm going to be doing 3 varieties: the Ragged Jack, the Nero di Toscano, and the Scarlet Kale. And these ones will keep going. Some of them can keep going all winter long. It depends how harsh the winter is, but kale is another good one. I like to harvest it and then chop it up, freeze it, and then put it into smoothies. I've just found that once it's frozen and then you put it in the smoothie, it kind of disappears a bit more. Also good to just throw it into soups or stews. It's a great way to get in a couple more nutrients. And lastly, the mustards. So I'm growing this one. I tried it in the spring, it didn't do well. So I'm gonna try it now. And I'm also gonna try growing this one inside hydroponically. So we'll see how it does. Off of the vegetables for a second, talk about flowers, because one of the things I'm trying to do is plant more pollinator friendly flowers. So one of the ones I'm in love with are the cosmos. These are still good to plant now. I got these pretty apricot lemonade ones. And these, which I'm obsessed with. I didn't like zinnias. But then I came across the queen limes. So this is the queen lime red. And then there's a queen lime blush, and a queen lime orange, which I want to get. And then I'm gonna grow all of them next year. So that's pretty much it. So those are some of the things you can plant in a Zone 5B garden in July to have a fall harvest. Just a couple things to remember, just to sum it all up. It's not too late. You need to know your first fall frost date. You need to know how many frost-free days you have left. You need to pick, for your cold-sensitive plants, you need to make sure you're picking ones that are early to maturity. And then also knowing your frost-hardy plants, you need to provide them shade. You need to protect them from pests, water them deeply, and I think that's it. And then you can have a fabulous late fall. Some of them will keep going into winter. I really hope that you found this video useful. If you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, because YouTube likes that, and then it helps me reach more people. So if you didn't already, don't forget to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And until next time, as always, don't forget to enjoy the little things and make food grow. Bye guys.